after this, we've got a round table where we can all have a chat. You can ask any questions to our presenters, voice some opinions, throw in some topics that you might be interested in. It's a completely open forum, so do take advantage of that. Got some beers afterwards. So keep filling out your feedback forms. Neil's almost ready.
I'm
just breaking the mic.
Get the mic. Ready.
Awesome.
There you go. Can you hear it? Literally a 60-minute. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, good. All right, yeah, so I'm going to be quick because I realise you're in between beers and stuff. So this is generally not just securing AVD, but any DAS solution really, or generally within Azure as well. So I see a lot of Azure environments, a lot of AVD environments. So I'm going to cover things very, very quickly. These are just an outline stuff that we're going to talk about today. This is stuff that I see customers don't do. Okay, not once have I ever seen a customer deploy a AVD or any DAS environment properly, okay, because they just leave everything in the defaults. So we're going to cover policies, we're going to cover MFA, conditional access, SSO, Azure Firewall, OS security patching, trusted launch, defending for endpoint, Intune compliance policies, and idle timeout policies. Okay, so question for the audience. Has anyone ever seen all of these stuff implemented within an enterprise environment? I prove my point. Okay. Most of these don't cost anything, right? Some of them do, but most of them don't cost you anything, okay? So, why do we want to do this? Obviously, within Azure, with DAS, with anything, people just leave to see things as defaults, okay? They deploy stuff, they don't configure it, they just deploy it as it is out of the box. That's not a good thing to do, because you can lock down pretty much anything at zero extra cost, okay? And this is stuff that we're going to talk about today. One of the biggest things which blocks security is user experience. And that's the main reason why a lot of people don't do stuff like this, because they think it may sort of break things, or they may think it block it, that kind of thing as well. So they're scared to touch stuff, they're scared to change stuff. And the best way that you can secure an environment is to make things as easy and seamless as possible, right? The more you lock stuff down, the harder it is going to be for the end user, the more they're going to either not use it or they're going to bypass it, okay? So if we can make it easy as possible, which we're going to talk about how you can do that today, so it's a seamless user experience using the maximum security that you can possibly can do. Okay, so ignore the nerdier bits off this slide, by the way. As I only found out I was doing this last night, so I had to get these slides very quickly. So this is the general architecture that you'll see from Azure Virtual Desktop environment. We've got lots of things going on here. We've got VNets, we've got resource groups, we've got domain controllers. All of this stuff needs to be locked down, okay? And we can easily lock it down at zero cost, okay? We can use network security groups, we can set permissions on resource groups, we can do conditional access for the authentication. There's a lot of stuff that we can do, but for some reason, I don't know why, people just don't do it, okay? Okay, so the first thing I see, which people never ever do, is storage accounts, okay? So when you create a storage account by default within Azure, it's available for anyone, okay? It's publicly accessible. There is a simple thing you can do. Again, it doesn't cost anything. You can enable a firewall on the storage account, okay? And using that firewall, you can do VNet restrictions to set only your session hosts to access that exotic user profile on that storage account. Again, very, very, very rarely do I see it. You can also do private endpoints. Private endpoints are highly secure. Probably 10% of environments which I look at use private endpoints, okay? It's a very easy way to secure, and guess what? It doesn't cost anything, okay? But people just don't do it because they either don't know how to or they're scared of breaking the environment. Azure Policies. Guess what? It doesn't cost anything. You can create an Azure policy within your environment to lock it down to only deploy VMs to certain regions, to only deploy VMs to certain VNets, to only allow certain resources, to disallow public endpoints. No one uses them. I don't know why, and maybe it's because of the skills gap, people don't know how to use them, but they're very, very easy to deploy once you get the basics. And you can just set a blueprint across the whole of your Azure environment and only allow it to deploy what you tell it to, or what you allow it to do, okay? MFA. Now, this, there probably is a bit of a cost to it, because if you want a highly secure MFA, you need Azure AD P2 license, which you get automatically if you use sort of E5 licensing, sort of M365 E5 licensing. But again, I've walked into many, many, many environments where they've got E5, they don't use it. So using MFA, we can set down lots of conditional access policies where we can only allow access based on location, for example, or we can only allow access based on what device you're using. You can tune those together with Intune compliance policies to say only allow access to my corporate network if my device is compliant from Intune and I'm from this known location, for example. Okay? Very, very simple, probably more common. It's what a lot of people do because I know Microsoft do a lot to kind of preach that to try and get people to force them to use it. But definitely worth looking into. Is probably the best and easiest way to secure your environment because the sort of AD security is probably the first point of attack if a hacker's going to try and get into your environment. Okay, and these are just the different licenses you use. So if you want basic MFA, you can get that with the Azure AD Premium P1. You can actually enable it, the free version, but that enables it for the whole network, so you don't want to do that. So if you want to do all the conditional access MFA, you can either be using Azure Premium P1, which you get with an E3, or P2, which you get with an E5. P2 gives you a bit of extra functionality where you can set based on trust, for example. So I can basically, if I'm from an unknown location or if I'm from a network which is known to be vulnerable by Microsoft because they track all the locations like where hackers hacking from and stuff like that as well, that's what the extra sort of P2 licensing gives you. I'm not going to go over in detail because we're going to go this very quickly, but that's generally what that conditional access looks like. It's looking at your location, it's looking at your applications, it gets a risk factor of where you're coming in from, and if you meet all those requirements, it's going to allow you access into your Azure Virtual Desktop environment. And as I mentioned, you can do this across everything. Okay, this is not just AVD, this is Citrix, AWS, whatever, you can apply these rules to as well. Okay, so this is how you basically set up a conditional access. Very, very, very simple. All we just need to do so who here does Azure AD conditional access? Nearly everyone. Okay, good. So it's the easiest and simplest way. So again, I won't spend a long time because you probably know it, but we just set some criteria like assignments, what location you're coming in for, what application you're accessing. So obviously if we're doing Azure Virtual Desktop, we can just use the Azure Virtual Desktop stuff there as well. User risk, so there we configure the sign-in risk where we configure want it set to be sort of medium, high, low. And then that's where you configure all the device platforms and user locations where you won't be able to sign in from. So for example, I could say, if I'm coming in from on-prem location, don't prompt me for MFA, but if I'm coming in from an external location, prompt me for MFA, for example. And you can do that on a per application basis as well. Yeah, that's just different device locations. So the other thing which I've not seen many people use yet, but it's probably the future of the way security should be going, is passwordless and SSO. Okay, passwords are a bit yesterday now. Microsoft see passwords as a low security because there's something that a hacker can get into, get hold of, and then access your resources. So currently within Azure Virtual Desktop in public preview is sort of passwordless SSO logon. Okay, you need the Azure AD to be able to do that. And then what that basically does, you can configure it via Intune, where you can configure the client to automatically subscribe to your feed, and then it will automatically read your logon credentials and then essentially pass those through using a sort of KRBGBT token back to Azure AD and Active Directory. Pass the token back, then automatically pass through the credentials going through. So if I'm on a device, log into the network, I don't need to enter any passwords to enter my session. Okay? If I'm using Windows Hello, I just log onto my device using Windows Hello. I click on the AVD icon, that automatically launches my desktop. I don't use any passwords at all. Okay, so that's, from a security point of view, that's a lot better, right? Because to log on to the device, I need to be in front of that device. There's no way I can get around it, okay? I have to be there. I'm using that Windows Hello authentication. So from a security point of view, it's a lot better, but obviously you need to have all that stuff in the background configured and to enable that to run as well. But that's the way it's going in the future. And if you're looking for a highly secure environment, that's what you should be getting towards as well. And we can use something like FIDO2 keys as well, if you want to add that little bit extra physical security to get onto the devices. And these are just the requirements that you need for that. So you need Windows 10 Enterprise or multi-session, Windows 10 or 11. And the session host must be Azure AD joined or hybrid joined, so they're registered against Azure AD. And you need to create an Azure AD Kerberos server, which is basically just an object within your Azure AD, which speaks back to your Active Directory environment, which passes all the authentication through and issues all the tokens and stuff like that as well. As I said, it's public preview. It's not out yet, but hopefully it'll be out soon. It's basically the blocker is Azure AD. So obviously there's a lot of stuff going in the background with Azure AD to get this to work. So Microsoft needs to make sure it works with everything else which they do as well. So it takes a long time to get all that stuff working. So to configure that, we just need to configure some connection properties on host pool level and tell it to use that. If it fails, it will just fall back to normal authentication mechanism anyway. So you can enable it, and then if it's just not configured, it just won't block you. It will just fall back to normal authentication. Azure firewalls. So who here uses Azure firewalls? Okay, who here uses other firewalls? Okay, so quite a few people don't use the firewall at all. Interesting. Okay, so Azure Firewall is basically, obviously what it is Azure Firewall, where you can route all your traffic through to a firewall for inspection. Okay, so we can create firewall rule sets within there, either block or allow traffic or inspect it for known vulnerabilities. So again, I don't really see it used much within Azure Virtual Desktop. And it's actually quite interesting because anyone who's been around for a while knows that what most people actually do, they use Azure Firewall and then they'll split some of the traffic out. So because they know Microsoft is a trusted source, essentially, they'll put all their corporate traffic through the Azure Firewall, but they'll allow all their normal, like Office 365 authentication traffic outside of the firewall, straight onto the Microsoft backbone network. I see that happen quite a lot, but for those really secure environments, they want to stick everything through the Azure Firewall, which kind of makes sense, but it has its own set of problems. So what we can do with Azure Firewalls, we can do application network level filtering, we can just do NAT, loads of stuff. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail for it, but you can integrate it quite nicely within like Azure Virtual Desktop, so you can configure like tags and stuff on the resources, so you don't have to manually create all the rules, you just set the tags and it just allows all that traffic through automatically as well, so quite easy to configure. Yeah, I'll skip past that bit. So we just outbound, so you probably can't read that, but I can give you this, but if you need to run like minimum AVD, so quite a few times we start with a customer who's locked down. So obviously best security practice is to lock down everything by default and only allow stuff when you need it. Okay, so I spent many, many hours looking at Azure firewall logs from companies where they say they just want to block everything. Then you basically go through, analyze the traffic, see what's been requested, then allow that, allow that, allow that. It takes quite a lot of time, but this is the result of probably a lot of the work that I've done to let that through for a typical Azure Virtual Desktop environment. Patching. Again, I'm sure we've all had those stories where people don't patch, right? I remember working for one financial institution. I did a PVS project for them. I went back to that financial institution 2 years later, and to my horror, it was running the same PVS version image. And I was like, what the fuck? And this is the bank, right? So I was like, why has this not been done? And I'm like, well, we didn't know how to do it. It wasn't working. So they just left it.
Did you patch it or did you leave it?
So do you know what it was? So you like this. So do you remember for PVS, you had the vdisk image version files, right? And if it doesn't shut down cleanly, it just goes into lock state, and that means you can't open it into read-write mode. It was that. So I logged onto the device, deleted the lock file, opened it up, patched it, bam, bam, done. Took me half an hour. But
So what did you charge?
yeah, but we see that quite often. So security patching should be easy. It is easy, and there's a lot of things you can do. What I'm seeing more often these days is actually companies actually rebuilding their images on a monthly basis. Not patching, but rebuilding. That's where you want to get to. Okay, so you want to get to a stage where you've automated all the application installations, and every month I'm just basically running a script, rebuilding an image, pulling the latest image down from the marketplace, and then that's just nice and easy. And then you do the same thing for your host, just replace all your hosts, job done. Sit there, forget it. You don't have to worry about security patching ever again. Yep, forget the nerdy a bit. Sorry if I had to take on the nerdy stuff out again. Yep, I'll forget that. But if you want to do automatic unit patching, you can do that via nerdy. I'm not supposed to say that, by the way. Right, okay, so the next thing is trusted launch. So again, who here uses trusted launch? Two people. Okay, so trusted launch, obviously when Microsoft launched Windows sort of 11, you had all this sort of TPM, and you could do trusted launch automatically, which basically protects the OS, the core of the OS, all these sort of DLL files, stuff like that as well. So you can actually have trusted launch sort of images within Azure. Okay, so obviously you have to create the image as a Gen 2 machine, and then you need to configure trusted launch to enable that to do that as well. But again, 0 extra costs, right? Doesn't cost you anything. And then you can just give you the extra level of security. So if a hacker does do some web rootkits or something, they can't do it, okay? Because the operating system is protected at the kernel level, right? So it makes it a lot harder to hack into the image. Nope, there is no demo. So one of the things which I've been looking at recently is Defender for Endpoint. Now, what we're starting to see is a lot of Microsoft native solutions out there. Okay, so to run a virtual environment, you used to have lots of third-party products, right? You'd have a third-party solution for backup, you'd have a third-party solution for security, you'd have a third-party solution for pretty much everything, because the Microsoft solution wasn't really good enough. Now, Microsoft are seen as one of the leaders in security, because they've put a lot of time and investment into their sort of security, where everything's kind of interlinked with each other. Okay, so you can interlink all your Intune policies to configure Defender for Endpoint. They've got lots of people sort of analyzing what's going on in the world with hackers and stuff, and lots of like really good fast responses to that. So Defender for Endpoint is a paid-for solution that you put onto your environment. So obviously, you know Defender, that's the free solution, but there's no active monitoring. It's just actually scanning for antivirus, stuff like that. But Defender for Endpoint is where you're going to register against the Defender for Endpoint service, and then Microsoft's going to monitor your solution for you, essentially. And then if you're getting hacked, or if it's something which it knows is a vulnerability, it'll tell you. Okay, it'll raise alerts to you, and then you can get it automatically do stuff as well. So if there's a known vulnerability and you are getting attacked, you can tell it to just block that machine access, for example. So it gives you a bit of less peace of mind. Now, the only thing is, it's not cheap. If you want to like full security, including Defender for Endpoint PT, you're looking at like £45 a month per user, which is not cheap. But if you compare that to like a third-party security solution, it's actually not too bad. Okay, so if you want the security, you can definitely have that as well.
Is there any big performance overhead?
Yeah, so I was working with one customer. They've got like 8,000 desktop, single-session desktops. They started having really loads of performance issues. Microsoft did loads of analysis on it, and they pointed to one of their documentations where Defender for Endpoint, the recommended machine spec is 4 CPU and 16 gigs of RAM. Because they were running it on a 8 gig machine with 2 CPU, and it just couldn't handle it because it's doing so much analyzing in the processor. So yeah, you do have to have a pretty beefy machine to get it to run properly. It comes at a price. It comes at a cost. But yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the downside of it. But that's always been the way, right? I mean, who remembers installing McAfee on Citrix, on PVS, right? Horrible.
I have seen it fight with the security tools as well. So they just start like looking at each of them, and they're both doing things, they're both suddenly generating logs, and
yeah.
Then your CPU just goes crazy because they're both
yeah.
They both think each other's doing the same project.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not security mad, I mean, for me, a lot of companies are quite happy just with Defender. It seems to do the job for them. Okay. So installation, you have to onboard the machines. Now, in a Citrix or AVD environment, there is an onboarding script which you can run, because if you're doing a lot of non-persistent, you'll get like duplicate machines and stuff like that in the sort of endpoint console. So, for example, you can just run a script when the machine is created, and then run an offboarding script when the machine is deleted as well. That solves that problem. You can also configure a group policy to automatically register against the Defender for Endpoint service as well. And what it gives you, it basically gives you a shit ton of information about the machine, and that's probably why it's using so many resources, right? So it tells you when it last scans, it tells you the amount of the vulnerabilities that you've got. It tells you about, if you click on all recommendations, it tells you each like CVE, what they are, and how to resolve them and stuff like that as well. So you get a lot of reporting about what's happening with your environment. Unfortunately, I was going to show you a demo on the console and stuff, but we're not going to have time. But it's really cool what it does. And it goes like really deep level as well. So it tells you how to do. And that's your security. So it tells you like security recommendations as well about how to sort of get your scores. So it looks at scores and how to improve your security posture looking at your host. So it's pretty cool that way as well. And these are the kind of things as well. So if you look on each VM, you can go in like really deep like network packet level to see what it's doing and what it's communicating at. And it'll kind of tell you if it's a risk or something. So it's going to tell me there like MCPM did runs attempted to crypt credentials and stuff like that as well. So it'll go as deep as you want it to go. But it'll cost to sort of processor use as well. But if you're security mad, then if you really want a really, really tight lockdown environment, then that's the price that you've got to pay, really, don't you? But the options are there if you need it, really, essentially. And that's my whistle-stop tour of a 60-minute presentation in 30 minutes, so you can all drink beer faster.